The sun was setting over San Onofre, California, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Linda Curry sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee as her husband Paul busied himself with his evening routine. It was a scene that to anyone on the outside seemed perfect, a picture of a married couple going through the motions of daily life. But Linda could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Something wasn't quite right. The fatigue that had plagued her for weeks wasn't going away. She woke up every morning feeling more drained than the day before. Her body felt heavy, her mind clouded as though she was walking through a fog she couldn't shake. But Paul, her husband of 10 years, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't want to notice. Either way, it was as if he was oblivious to the subtle shift in their household. Paul had been distant lately, lost in his own thoughts more often than not. Linda could hardly remember the last time they had shared a real conversation. He had become preoccupied with their finances, always talking about their insurance policy, sometimes bringing it up in casual conversation as though it were just another part of the household budget. Linda, though not a stranger to financial talks, found his sudden fixation on the subject strange, unnerving even. Her mind had started to wander during these conversations. Could it be that Paul was planning something she couldn't see? She brushed the thought away. She had known Paul for years, trusted him with everything, but this nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. A sharp pain in her stomach interrupted her thoughts, and she grimaced, clutching her abdomen. "Linda, you okay?" Paul's voice cut through the silence, his tone half-hearted, as if his concern was more for her comfort than her health. She smiled weakly. "Just a stomach ache. I'll be fine." But even as the words left her mouth, Linda wasn't convinced. This wasn't just an ordinary illness. It felt different. For the past few days, she had been feeling increasingly sick. Her stomach churned with nausea, her head felt heavy, and no matter how much she rested, she couldn't shake the overwhelming exhaustion. Something in her gut told her this wasn't just a virus. She hadn't had a cold in months, and this wasn't like any flu she had ever experienced. Still, she tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. She didn't want to worry Paul. He had enough on his plate, especially with his work. So many late nights at the office. The financial pressure was starting to get to him, she could tell. The stress was creeping into his demeanor, making him irritable and withdrawn. But that didn't explain her growing symptoms. She could feel the change in her body, the way it refused to cooperate, as if something inside was slowly shutting down. She tried to ignore it, until one night, when the nausea was so severe, she couldn't even sit up. Sitting at the dinner table, Linda looked at her husband across from her. Paul seemed like his usual self, focused on his plate, his mind somewhere else. Her gaze lingered on him, a feeling of uncertainty creeping in. He looked just like the man she married, but was he really the same? That night, after Paul had gone to bed, Linda lay awake in the dark. The unease settled deeper within her, gnawing at her. It was as if her body was whispering a truth she wasn't yet ready to hear. Something was terribly wrong. She couldn't place it, not yet. The peaceful evening, the calm before the storm, was only the quiet facade of something much more sinister, something Linda wasn't prepared for, but which she was about to discover, far too late. Linda sat in the sterile white room of the hospital, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the chair. Paul was beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers, but his presence felt distant, as if his mind was elsewhere. His eyes were fixed on the clock on the wall, his movements stiff. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived at the hospital, only offering brief reassurances that everything would be fine. But Linda could feel the air between them, heavy with an unspoken truth, a truth that she wasn't ready to face, but that was now creeping in, inescapable. The doctor entered the room and Linda immediately felt a sense of dread. His face was unreadable, but there was something in the way he avoided her eyes that made her heart race. He sat down in front of them, the medical chart in his hand. "Mrs. Curry, we've run the tests, and the results are concerning," the doctor began, his voice steady but tinged with something Linda couldn't quite place. "You've been poisoned, Mrs. Curry, with ethylene glycol." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The words didn't fully register in Linda's mind. Poisoned? The thought was absurd. She had never imagined something like this happening to her. She looked over at Paul, who immediately looked away, his face turning pale. His hand shifted nervously, betraying a crack in the calm facade he had so carefully maintained. Linda's heart began to pound in her chest. "What do you mean? How?" How could this happen? Her voice was barely a whisper, almost afraid to speak the words aloud, as if they were a curse she might invite into her life if she said them. The doctor continued, explaining the symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning: nausea, fatigue, dizziness, symptoms Linda had been experiencing for days. He mentioned how the substance could cause kidney failure and brain damage if left untreated. Linda's mind raced. She had no idea how it was possible. She hadn't touched anything suspicious. Her food had been prepared at home, and everything seemed normal, except Paul. The thought hit her like a cold wave. Had she missed something? She remembered the past few days, the strange behaviors, the way Paul had been acting distant, almost secretive, the way he'd brushed off her concerns when she'd tried to talk to him about her health. Had it all been leading up to this? Paul spoke, his voice tight. "Linda, I don't know what he's talking about. You've been working too hard. Stress, exhaustion, that's all it is. We need to just rest and you'll feel better soon." His tone was reassuring, but Linda could hear the tremor underneath it, the desperation in his voice. She studied his face, trying to read him, but his expression was unreadable. His eyes darted to the doctor, then quickly back to her. The way he avoided eye contact sent a shiver down her spine. The doctor must have noticed the tension in the room because he spoke again. "Mrs. Curry, I suggest you take this matter very seriously. I've already alerted the authorities, and they will be investigating this. Poisoning is a serious crime, and we need to find out how this happened." Linda nodded absent-mindedly, her mind whirling. Poisoned. By someone. But who? She looked at Paul again. The question was hanging between them, a question she didn't dare ask out loud. As the doctor left to prepare paperwork for the authorities, Linda turned to Paul. Did you do this to me?" The words were barely audible, but they were there, hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Paul froze. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, Linda saw something flicker in his gaze, a flash of panic, a hesitation that he quickly masked. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Linda, you're not thinking straight. This is just a mistake. We need to get through this together. I love you." He reached for her hand again, but this time Linda pulled it away. The silence between them was deafening. Linda stared at him, her pulse racing. The truth was becoming clear. The seeds of doubt were planted, and they were growing with each passing second. She could feel it, the cold realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The man she had trusted, the man she had built a life with, could very well be the one who had put her in this position. But was she imagining it? Could she truly suspect him? Her heart told her one thing, but her mind was still trying to make sense of it. The doctor had said poisoning. Paul had been acting strange. The life insurance policy, the increasing tension. Was it all connected? Was she just being paranoid? Before she could speak again, the door opened and 2 police officers entered the room. Their presence only deepened the feeling of dread that had settled in Linda's stomach. She was no longer just a victim of illness. She was now part of something much darker, a crime that threatened to unravel her world. The sterile hospital room closed in on Linda. It had been hours since the doctors confirmed she'd been poisoned, yet her mind couldn't fully grasp it. Ethylene glycol, poisoned, by someone close to her. The words circled in her head, a cruel mantra she couldn't escape. The thought felt too surreal, too impossible. Paul had stayed by her side, his presence a constant shadow, but each word he spoke felt hollow, rehearsed, like a performance. His gestures were stiff, calculated. Linda replayed every detail of the past few weeks, desperately searching for a sign, a hint that might explain this nightmare. Her mind flashed back to the moment when the doctor had said the word poisoning. Paul's face had briefly gone pale, too startled, too quick to mask his reaction. He'd clenched her hand harder, as if bracing for something. Linda's heart had skipped in that instant. There was something about his reaction that didn't sit right with her. Something was off. The more she thought, the more questions arose. Paul had been distant, irritable even. It wasn't just stress from work. He had been obsessing over their finances. He had casually mentioned their life insurance policy, asked her to look over the beneficiaries, talked about what-ifs with a calmness that now felt wrong, calculated. The suspicion gnawed at her, growing stronger with every passing minute. Could it really be him? The man she'd shared everything with? Could he have put her in this position, orchestrating her slow death for something as cold as money? She closed her eyes, the thought too much to bear. But the evidence was mounting, undeniable. Ethylene glycol, the poisoning, his odd behavior. "Linda," Paul's voice broke through her thoughts. He leaned in closer, his voice low and soothing. Trust me, we'll get through this. It's just a bump in the road, nothing more. She couldn't bring herself to take his hand this time. His touch, once reassuring, now felt foreign, suffocating. I don't know if I can, Paul, she whispered, her voice trembling. It was a confession she wasn't ready to make, but it had to be said. The doubt that had been quietly growing inside her spilled out. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. For a moment, Paul said nothing. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him. Panic, a flash of something dark that he quickly masked. He smiled, but it was forced, thin. You're overreacting, he said, his tone soft, almost too calm. It's just a misunderstanding. We'll figure it out. Just stay calm. Linda felt the words like a slap. She tried to shake them off, but the pieces were falling into place. His obsession with the life insurance policy, his fixation on the numbers, his increasing detachment from her health. The realization hit her like ice. Paul had the most to gain if she were gone. Before she could respond, the door creaked open. Detective Monroe stepped inside, his presence like a breath of fresh air, cutting through the suffocating tension. His eyes were serious, but kind. Mrs. Curry, we need to talk, he said, his voice firm but understanding. We're investigating the poisoning. We need your help. Linda glanced at Paul. He stiffened at the mention of the investigation, his face tightening, his usual composure slipping away. She felt the walls closing in. This was no longer just about her illness. This was about something darker, something she wasn't ready to confront but couldn't avoid. Linda, you're not thinking clearly, Paul said, his voice rising slightly, panic creeping in. The calm mask was slipping. He wasn't as confident as he had been moments ago. Am I? She whispered, barely able to hear herself. She didn't know if she was thinking clearly or if her mind was spiraling. But the doubt was there, relentless. What if it was him? What if Paul had orchestrated this whole nightmare? The truth hung just out of reach, but it was coming, whether she was prepared for it or not. As Paul reached for her hand again, she pulled away. The final thread of trust snapped inside her. The doubt had taken root, and now it was growing, unstoppable. The police had arrived shortly after Detective Monroe. Linda felt the shift in the atmosphere. What had been a hospital visit now felt like the beginning of an investigation, a nightmare she hadn't fully embraced until that moment. The calm, clean hospital room, where she had once felt safe, now seemed suffocating. As the officer spoke with the doctor and took down initial notes, Linda could feel Paul's presence beside her, more distant than ever. Linda, we'll take care of this. Don't worry, Paul said, but his voice was strained, brittle. Linda didn't respond. She couldn't. His words sounded hollow, empty. A part of her had already shut down, disconnected from the man she had married. She focused on the detective instead. Detective Monroe had stayed quiet, observing the unfolding situation, his sharp eyes taking everything in. Mrs. Curry, the detective said, pulling her attention back to him. I know this is difficult, but we need to ask you some questions. It's important we get a full understanding of what happened. Can you recall anything unusual? Anything out of the ordinary? Linda sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. She couldn't remember much of what happened before the illness took hold, but certain things started coming back to her, fragments of memories she had dismissed at the time. Paul has been acting strange lately, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I didn't think it meant anything. Monroe's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression hardening. What do you mean by strange? He asked. Linda hesitated. She was reluctant to reveal her growing suspicions, but now, in this sterile room with strangers and authorities surrounding her, she could no longer keep the thought buried. He's been distant, obsessed with our finances, the life insurance policy. She trailed off, feeling the weight of the words hanging in the air. Monroe didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly. Tell me more. Linda looked over at Paul, who had been standing silently by the wall. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped together in front of him. His eyes flicked nervously between Linda and the detective. The unease was palpable. I didn't think it was anything at first, Linda continued. But now, the way he talked about it, the way he kept bringing it up, it felt wrong, like he was more concerned about the policy than anything else. Monroe leaned in, his voice low but firm. You're not imagining things, Mrs. Curry. The fact that your illness matches the symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning isn't a coincidence. We've already begun looking into your husband's recent purchases. Linda's heart skipped a beat. She had been trying to dismiss the thought, but hearing it out loud made it undeniable. Everything, Paul's behavior, the life insurance, pointed to him. Paul, sensing the direction the conversation was taking, finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "Linda, you're being paranoid. I'm not the one who did this to you. You're sick and we're going to figure this out together. Don't let them confuse you." His words, meant to reassure her, only made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The fear in his voice didn't match the calm he was trying to project. Linda swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. The detective had already called for a more thorough investigation into the life insurance policy. The pieces were falling into place, but Linda wasn't sure how much more she could take. Her world was crumbling, and the man she had trusted most was at the center of it all. The detective turned to Paul, his tone even. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Curry. We'll need to follow up with some more questions about your purchases and your financial records." Paul's face paled. "You're making a mistake," he muttered under his breath. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of." His hands clenched into fists, but his eyes were locked on Linda, pleading with her silently. Linda stared back, but it wasn't the same. The doubts had taken root, and they couldn't be erased now, no matter how much Paul begged. As the police finished their statements and began to leave, Linda was left alone with Paul. The room, once filled with the quiet hum of machines and voices, now felt suffocating like a prison. Linda couldn't look at him. Her mind was still processing everything, but her heart had already started to shut him out. "I didn't do it, Linda," Paul said, his voice cracking as he reached for her. "I love you. You have to believe me." Linda recoiled. She couldn't. The truth was too much to deny now, and as much as she wanted to trust him, as much as she had loved him, she couldn't ignore what her instincts were screaming at her. Something had broken between them, and it could never be repaired. The door to the hospital room clicked shut behind the detective, leaving Linda and Paul in the silence of their shared history, now fractured beyond repair. Linda felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy cloak. The turning point had arrived, and with it, the realization that she had to face a truth she wasn't ready to accept. But she would. She had to, for her own survival. The days that followed the hospital visit felt like they had stretched into weeks. Linda barely spoke to Paul, each word from him seeming more like a manipulation than a reassurance. He tried, how he tried, to convince her it was just an illness, nothing more, but each time he spoke, his voice faltered. The distance between them grew, and Linda began to notice the cracks in his carefully crafted facade. He had been unusually calm during the police's visit, but there was a certain edge to his composure now. Every time she caught his eye, there was something different, a flash of guilt, or maybe it was something else. She couldn't tell, but it didn't matter anymore. Doubt had taken root, and she couldn't ignore it. Every smile, every touch now felt like a calculated effort to reassure her, but it only pushed her further away. The tension at home was suffocating. She had tried to carry on as if things were normal, but every glance, every movement seemed tainted by the uncertainty that had settled between them. It was as if they were both trapped in a game, one that Linda was no longer willing to play. One evening, after a long silence between them, Paul finally spoke. "Linda," he said softly, his voice just above a whisper, "I know you're scared, but you're letting this get to your head. I didn't do anything wrong. You have to trust me." She didn't respond at first, staring out the window, her mind racing. He always said the same thing, always tried to convince her, but every word felt more like an attempt to control the situation, to regain power over her. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore," Linda said quietly, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Linda felt like she was finally saying what needed to be said. The weight of the doubt that had been building within her was now out in the open. Paul's eyes flickered, the facade cracking just enough for Linda to see the tension in his face. His lips twitched as if he wanted to say something, but he hesitated. Linda could feel his control slipping away, and it made her heart race. "Linda, you're not thinking clearly," Paul said, his voice thick with desperation. "This is all just a misunderstanding. You're letting them fill your head with lies." But Linda wasn't listening anymore. She had stopped hearing the reassuring words, the endless excuses. She knew what she had to do, but the realization was both terrifying and liberating. She could feel it in her bones, the realization that something much darker was at play, something she couldn't ignore any longer. A knock on the door broke her thoughts, and Linda opened it to find Detective Monroe standing there, his face unreadable. "We need to talk, Mrs. Curry," he said without preamble. his gaze flicking briefly to Paul before returning to her. Paul stiffened immediately, but Linda didn't look at him. She stepped aside and motioned for the detective to enter. "I've been going over the details of your case, and there's something we need to address. We found something that could help us understand what's been happening," Detective Monroe continued. The mention of new evidence made Linda's pulse quicken. She hadn't expected this. Her mind raced, wondering what they had found. She glanced briefly at Paul, who was now standing by the window, his back turned, arms crossed. His posture was tense, and Linda couldn't ignore the feeling that he was trying to hide something. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. Monroe took a deep breath before speaking. "We discovered that Paul purchased ethylene glycol just days before you started showing symptoms. It was bought under his name at a local hardware store." Linda's heart skipped a beat. The evidence was undeniable. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. She turned to Paul, her eyes wide. He didn't move, didn't say anything, but she could feel the shift in the air, the change in him that couldn't be hidden any longer. "Paul," Linda whispered, her voice trembling. He turned slowly, his face pale but unreadable. "Linda, you don't understand," he began, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is all a misunderstanding. I would never hurt you." But Linda could see it now. The truth was staring her in the face, and there was no denying it. Everything lined up, his strange behavior, the obsession with the insurance policy, the purchase of the poison. The pieces had finally fallen into place, and they painted a chilling picture. Her hands trembled, and she struggled to steady her breathing. "I trusted you," she said, the words laced with a pain that cut deeper than any physical wound could. "How could you do this to me?" The silence between them was suffocating. Paul's face shifted, the cold mask of indifference finally cracking. He reached out toward her, but Linda stepped back, shaking her head. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't trust you anymore." The door to their home, once a place of comfort, now felt like the door to a prison. Linda could no longer ignore the truth that had been buried for so long. As the weight of the moment settled over her, she realized something she hadn't yet fully grasped. Paul's betrayal was not just about the poison. It was about the lies, the manipulation, and the deceit that had been festering for far too long. The investigation was taking shape. Every piece of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place, but Linda couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. Even though the evidence was mounting against Paul, she was still grappling with the horror of the truth. The man she had spent years with, trusted with her life, was the one who had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. Detective Monroe had been diligent, but Linda could tell that something had shifted in him too. He was no longer just gathering facts. He was actively working to connect the dots. The quiet detective who had first entered her life with calm reassurance now seemed to carry the weight of the investigation on his shoulders. Linda sat in her living room, still reeling from the conversation with Paul. Her hands were cold as they gripped the edge of the chair. She hadn't said much since Paul's confession, his denial really, but everything about him now felt like a lie. She could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. The detective had hinted at something significant, something that could turn the case around. Just as she thought she couldn't bear the silence any longer, her phone rang. It was Detective Monroe. "Mrs. Curry, we've got something." His voice crackled over the line. "You need to come to the station. It's about the evidence we found." Linda's heart raced. Her mind flicked to Paul, who had retreated to the bedroom after their tense conversation. The door was closed, and she hadn't seen him for over an hour. Something told her that the detective had uncovered a breakthrough, one that could change everything. When Linda arrived at the police station, Monroe was waiting for her. He motioned for her to sit, his face grave. "We've got the footage," he said simply. Linda's breath caught in her throat. The footage? Of what? "Paul's purchase of the ethylene glycol was caught on tape. We've confirmed it. He bought the poison days before you started showing symptoms. We also found something else, something you need to see." Monroe led Linda to a small room where a screen displayed grainy footage. It was from a local hardware store a few blocks away from their home. The video showed Paul in broad daylight walking up to the counter with a bottle of ethylene glycol. He paid in cash. It was as clear as day. He had planned it all. He had purchased the poison, intending to use it on her. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, but something else was starting to settle in, something even darker. Paul's calm demeanor in the footage, his casual walk as he made the purchase, sent a cold shiver through her. This wasn't just a mistake. It was calculated. He had planned her death, and now she was staring at the proof. That's not all, Monroe continued, his voice lowering. We've also uncovered a record of multiple inquiries Paul made to the life insurance company. He's been asking about your policy, what it covers, how much he would get in the event of your death. Linda's heart stopped. She felt the ground beneath her shift. The picture was becoming clearer, sharper. Paul had been plotting this for months, and she had been blind to it. He hadn't just poisoned her. He had set up an entire plan to benefit from her death. I knew something was off, Linda whispered, more to herself than to Monroe. I knew he was hiding something, but I never imagined it would go this far. Monroe nodded gravely. This is serious, Mrs. Curry. You're lucky to be alive. But Linda wasn't feeling lucky. She was feeling betrayed. She was feeling violated in a way she couldn't even begin to process. The man who had stood by her for years, who had promised to love her, protect her, was the one who had been planning her murder. The betrayal cut deeper than any poison ever could. You need to confront him, Monroe said softly, his gaze intense. He's going to crack under the pressure. This is your chance. Linda took a deep breath, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. I can't face him again, she whispered. I don't know if I can ever look at him the same way again. Monroe placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to do this alone. We'll be here, and we'll make sure he pays for what he's done. Linda nodded, feeling the first stirrings of resolve. She was done being passive. The truth had finally come to light, and now it was time to make sure Paul faced the consequences of his actions. She would see this through. She had to. The detective escorted her to the door, and as Linda stepped back into the world, she felt something shift within her. The uncertainty, the doubt that had plagued her for so long was beginning to dissolve. The truth, harsh and ugly as it was the only thing left standing. Linda stood in the hallway, her fingers tight around the door frame. Her heart raced as she glanced at the closed door of the bedroom. Paul was in there, just a few feet away. After everything, after the endless lies, the betrayal, and the overwhelming evidence, she was about to face him. The reality of the moment felt surreal, but it was happening. There was no turning back now. She had spent the last few hours in silence, trying to process everything. The footage, the receipts, the testimony about the life insurance policy, the pieces had clicked together with terrifying clarity. Paul hadn't just poisoned her. He had orchestrated this entire nightmare, all for money, all for her death. The door creaked open slightly and Linda stepped inside. Paul was sitting on the bed, staring out the window. He didn't look at her when she entered. He was pretending that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and she was about to make him see it. Paul, Linda's voice cut through the stillness. Her throat felt tight, her words heavy, but she pushed forward. We need to talk. Paul stiffened. His shoulders tensed, but he still didn't turn to face her. About what, Linda? He said, his voice low, almost too calm, too controlled. He wasn't fooling her anymore. About everything, she said, about the poisoning, about the life insurance, about you. Her words hung in the air, thick with accusation. Paul's hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't turn to her. Instead, he let out a short laugh, a humorless sound that made Linda's skin crawl. You're overreacting, Linda. You always overreact. His voice was strained, though, as if he was trying to maintain control over the situation, but the tension in the room was palpable. His mask was slipping. Linda's heart pounded in her chest. No, this isn't overreacting. This is reality. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Her voice cracked, but she didn't back down. You poisoned me. You bought the poison. You knew exactly what you were doing. Paul finally turned to face her, his expression hardened, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Guilt? Fear? She couldn't be sure. I didn't mean for things to get this out of hand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to make sure you were taken care of. His attempt to sound convincing fell flat. She could hear the desperation in his voice. The lies were piling up, and he was losing his grip on them. Linda took a step closer, her body trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Taken care of? She repeated, her voice rising. By killing me? Is that what you really thought? That I wouldn't see through it? Paul stood up now, the panic creeping into his expression. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice frantic. I never meant to hurt you. I love you. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, his hands raised as if to beg for understanding that Linda would never give. You love me? She snapped. You love me enough to poison me? To plan my death for a payout? You didn't love me, Paul. You used me. You wanted my life insurance money and you thought you could get away with it. The words were like knives, and with each one, Linda could feel herself growing stronger. The disbelief, the anger, the fear, all of it was turning into something else. She wasn't just confronting him, she was reclaiming her life, reclaiming her power. Paul took a step toward her, his face twisted in frustration. You're making a mistake, Linda. You don't understand what it was like. The pressure, I didn't think. Linda raised her hand, cutting him off. Stop, just stop. I don't need your excuses. You've already said enough. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The truth was clear now. She didn't need his explanations or his apologies. She didn't need him. He was silent for a long moment, and for the first time, Linda saw him break. The facade was completely gone now. The man she had loved, the man she thought she knew, was no longer standing before her. What was left was a broken man, a coward too afraid to admit the depth of his betrayal. I didn't want it to end like this, he whispered, but there was no sincerity left in his words. He was still trying to manipulate her, to get back into her good graces, but Linda wasn't listening anymore. I'm done, she said, her voice steady now, despite the tears that had begun to form in her eyes. I'm done with you, Paul. For a moment, they just stood there, the room thick with the silence of broken trust. Then Linda turned on her heel and walked out, not looking back. She didn't need to. The man she had trusted, the man who had been a part of her life for so long, was gone. He had shown her who he truly was, and she wasn't going to waste another second of her life pretending that the person standing in front of her was the man she thought she knew. Linda couldn't bring herself to look back. The confrontation with Paul had left her drained, empty, but resolute. She had finally severed the last thread holding her to the life she had known. With every step she took away from him, away from the man she thought she loved, she felt the weight of the past few days lifting slightly. It wasn't over, not yet, but she could breathe again. She left the house without saying a word to Paul. He hadn't followed her. His silence was more deafening than any words he could have said. She had expected to feel a sense of closure, but instead, an uneasy tension lingered. Her mind couldn't stop racing, replaying the past week, trying to make sense of the new reality she was facing. As she drove through the quiet streets, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Linda's heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Detective Monroe. Linda, we need to meet. There's something we didn't know. The words immediately triggered a surge of adrenaline. She pulled over to the side of the road, her fingers trembling as she typed a response. What happened? Is it about Paul? The reply came almost instantly. Yes, we need to talk in person. Please come to the station. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she turned the car around. The nagging sense of dread that had settled in her chest during the confrontation with Paul now felt like a storm ready to break. What more could there be? What was left to uncover? When she arrived at the police station, Monroe was waiting for her, his expression tight, his eyes filled with something Linda couldn't place. Come inside, he said without preamble, leading her down the hallway to an interrogation room. The fluorescent lights above flickered as they walked, and Linda's thoughts ran wild. Had Paul confessed? Had they found more evidence? Monroe motioned for her to sit across from him at the table. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood by the window, his back to her, as if gathering his thoughts. The silence between them was heavy. Linda, Monroe finally spoke, turning to face her. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach tighten. There's something you need to know. Something that's come to light since we spoke last. Linda's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind immediately flashed back to the footage, to the receipts, to everything that had pointed toward Paul. What else could there be? I've been going over the financial records, Monroe continued, and I found something that doesn't quite add up. Paul didn't just buy the ethylene glycol. There was something else, something I didn't see before. Linda leaned forward, her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Monroe's eyes met hers, his gaze unwavering. I found a second insurance policy, one that Paul took out a few months ago, a policy on you. But it's not like the one you knew about. This one has a much higher payout, much higher, and it's in his name. Linda felt the floor drop out from under her. She couldn't process the words. A second policy? A higher payout? Why had she never known about this? That's not all, Monroe said, his voice lowering. The policy was specifically designed to be paid out in case of accidental death. He paused, watching her reaction carefully. You see, the first policy could have been seen as a suicide if something went wrong, but this one had no such clause. Linda's breath hitched, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in a way she never expected. Paul hadn't just been planning her death, he had been preparing for it. Every move, every conversation, every small act of control had been calculated, as if she were a pawn in his game. Monroe took a step closer, his voice quiet but firm. Linda, we believe Paul wasn't just trying to kill you for the money. He was making sure he had a guaranteed way out, and he was willing to go to any length to make it happen. For a moment, Linda was frozen, her mind reeling. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. All the signs had been there, but she had missed them. The manipulations, the lies, the obsession with the life insurance, all of it had been leading to this moment. This is it, Linda, Monroe said, his voice steady. The evidence we found connects Paul directly to this. He's been setting this up for months. Linda stood up abruptly, her mind spinning. I have to confront him, she said, her voice trembling but determined. I can't just wait anymore. Monroe's hand shot out to stop her. Linda, we've got him. You don't need to do anything else. We'll take care of it. But Linda wasn't listening. She couldn't sit back anymore. She had seen the full extent of Paul's manipulation, and now she needed to face him, to hear him admit it. She wasn't going to be a victim any longer. As she walked out of the station, her mind was made up. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about taking back control. She was going to make sure Paul paid for everything he had done, and she would make him face the consequences of his actions, no matter the cost. Linda couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly safe. Every corner of the house, every shadow in the hallway felt like a reminder of the man she had trusted and loved, the man who had nearly killed her. The reality of Paul's betrayal had been a punch to her gut, and she had spent every day since that moment trying to piece herself back together. But with each passing day, she could feel him slipping further away from her. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, was now a stranger with a dark agenda that she had never seen coming. After the detective had told her about the second insurance policy, Linda's mind had been racing. The truth had hit her like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just the poisoning, it was everything. Paul had been planning this for months, carefully orchestrating every detail. He had been living a double life, one where she was just a means to an end. She wasn't just his wife, she was his victim. And now, with the evidence piling up, Paul was becoming more erratic by the day. His behavior was shifting from defensive to outright manic. He was no longer trying to hide his feelings. Linda could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. And the man who stood before her now wasn't the person she had married. He was someone darker, someone unrecognizable. The nights were the hardest. Paul would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his eyes wide open, as if he were waiting for something. Linda could hear him whispering to himself in the dark, his words unintelligible, his breath quickening. It was clear he was unraveling, losing control of the narrative he had once constructed so carefully. Linda had tried to confront him again, to find out what was going through his mind, but each time, he had deflected her questions with a sharpness that made her skin crawl. I don't know why you keep pushing me, Linda, he had said one night, his voice trembling. You're making this worse. You don't understand what's at stake. But Linda did understand. She had started to understand everything. His desperation, his guilt, his fear. He wasn't just afraid of getting caught. He was afraid of losing the life he had carefully built, a life built on lies and manipulation. The guilt that had once been buried deep within him was now bubbling to the surface, and it was threatening to consume him. It was during one of these moments, when the tension was so thick in the air that Linda could barely breathe, that she realized something even more horrifying. Paul wasn't just afraid of the consequences of his actions, he was afraid of her. He was afraid of the truth coming out, and he would do anything to stop her from exposing it. That night, Linda awoke to the sound of rustling. She opened her eyes, her pulse quickening. The room was dark, but she could make out Paul's silhouette standing by the door. He hadn't heard her stir, and for a moment she thought about calling out to him, asking him what he was doing. But something in her gut told her to stay silent. The tension in the air felt like a live wire, and Linda instinctively knew that speaking might set him off. She watched as he moved toward the dresser, his steps quiet but deliberate. The faint gleam of something metallic caught her eye. A knife. He was holding a knife. Linda's heart skipped a beat. Panic gripped her chest. She could feel her breath quicken as she lay perfectly still, praying he wouldn't notice her. But she could see it in his eyes as he glanced over at her. There was a madness there now, something primal and wild. His expression was vacant, almost unhinged. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment that felt like an eternity. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. He dropped the knife onto the dresser, and Linda heard the quiet thud as it landed. He turned away, walking back to the bed and lying down as if nothing had happened. Linda's mind was racing. What was happening to him? Was he breaking down completely? The man who had poisoned her, who had planned her death, was now on the verge of snapping. His actions, his erratic behavior, were all signs that he was losing control of himself. And it terrified her, but Linda couldn't afford to be terrified anymore. She couldn't let fear dictate her next move. She had come too far. The truth was out there, and she was going to make sure it came to light, no matter what it took. The next morning, Paul acted as if nothing had happened. He was back to his calm, calculated self. But Linda could see it now. The cracks were there, the madness was creeping in, and she knew that sooner or later, Paul would make a mistake that would finally expose him for what he was. Linda wasn't going to wait for him to implode. She had seen enough to know that she couldn't trust him anymore. The descent into madness had begun, and she was no longer just a passive observer in her own life. The courtroom was quiet, the weight of anticipation heavy in the air. Linda sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been here before, sitting in the same place, the same room, but today felt different. Today she wasn't just an observer of justice, she was part of it. And today, Paul would answer for everything. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed in the courtroom, signaling the start of the trial. Linda took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The man who had nearly taken her life, the man she had trusted, was now facing the consequences of his actions. This was it, the final chapter in the nightmare that had begun months ago. Paul sat at the defense table, his face expressionless, but Linda could see the cracks beneath the surface. He was no longer the man who had tried to manipulate her. The man who had once smiled at her, who had held her hand in the hospital, now looked like a shell of the person he once was. The tension in his posture, the way his eyes flickered nervously around the courtroom, told Linda everything she needed to know. He was scared. For the first time, he was truly afraid. The prosecutor stood up, addressing the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a case of cold, calculated attempted murder. The evidence is clear. The defendant, Paul Curry, purchased the poison that nearly took the life of his wife, Linda Curry, and attempted to make it look like an accident. He went to great lengths to hide his crime. But in the end, the truth came out." Linda's heart pounded as the prosecutor continued, detailing the sequence of events, the purchase of ethylene glycol, the lies, the manipulation, the financial gain Paul stood to gain from her death. Each word felt like a punch, a reminder of how far Paul had gone. But with each accusation, Linda also felt something else, a sense of justice creeping in. This was no longer just about surviving. It was about making sure he paid for what he had done. As the prosecutor finished, Paul's defense attorney stood to speak. His voice was smooth, calm, designed to put doubt in the minds of the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are hearing is a story built on circumstantial evidence. My client is not a murderer. He did not attempt to kill his wife. This is a tragic misunderstanding, a series of unfortunate events that have been blown out of proportion." Paul's lawyer turned to him, offering a supportive glance. But Linda saw right through it. She saw the same man who had manipulated her, who had tried to convince her that she was imagining things, that she was overreacting. She saw the man who had tried to play the victim, but she wasn't buying it anymore. The defense lawyer tried to discredit the evidence, poking holes in the timeline, questioning Linda's recollection of events. But Linda didn't need to defend herself anymore. She didn't need to justify her experience to anyone. The truth was clear, and the jury could see it too. Finally, it was Linda's turn to take the stand. She stood up slowly, her knees trembling, but her resolve was unwavering. The room seemed to grow quiet as all eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I married Paul because I believed in him," she began, her voice ringing out clear. "I believed in us. But what I didn't know was that I wasn't just his wife. I was his victim. He had been planning to kill me for months. All the love he said he had for me, it was a lie. I was nothing but a means to an end." Linda paused, her gaze fixed on Paul. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but she could see the sweat forming on his brow. He was no longer the man who had tried to convince her she was crazy. He was a man who was watching everything he had built, the life, the lies, the manipulation, fall apart before his eyes. "I trusted him," Linda continued, her voice shaking but strong. "And he betrayed me in the most horrific way. I almost didn't make it out alive, but now I'm here. I'm alive, and I'm standing up for myself. I won't let him get away with what he did." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes, but she didn't look away. She didn't look away from the truth she had finally found. The truth that had been hidden beneath the layers of deceit and manipulation. She was stronger now, stronger than she had ever been. The room was silent as Linda finished her testimony, and she sat back down feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She had done it. She had faced her tormentor, and now the decision was in the hands of the jury. After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The foreman stood, his voice clear and firm as he read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Paul Curry, guilty of attempted murder." The words hit Linda like a wave. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. The justice she had been fighting for had finally arrived. Paul's face twisted in disbelief as the reality of the verdict set in. He had been caught, and now he would pay for what he had done. As the courtroom emptied, Linda stood, her heart still racing, but she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The trial was over, but her journey had just begun. She had faced the darkest part of her life, and now she could begin to heal. What do you think of Paul Curry's actions and the shocking betrayal he committed? Do you believe Linda could have ever seen it coming? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story gripping and want to hear more real-life crime stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update from our channel.